Okay, as I said before, we're going to discuss the Columbian Exchange. One way of understanding the Columbian Exchange is that it's kind of like how historians and anthropologists evaluate the impact of European exploration into the Western Hemisphere by using a kind of before and after, sort of before and after photographs of the period. What this Columbian Exchange is the exchange of products, resources, ideas, religions, philosophies, and even microbes and diseases. Okay, it's an exchange between, and this exchange, this encounter that happens between these two hemispheres is going to change both hemispheres forever. Some of the things in the exchange, extremely good. Other aspects of this Columbian Exchange, terribly detrimental to both sides. But as you will see, it's the Native American populations in the Western Hemisphere that are going to get the worst end of the Columbian Exchange. Now, we normally associate this Columbian Exchange with the things that come from Europe to the Americas and the thing that come from the Americas to Europe. So we'll start off with the things that come from Europe to the Americas. The first is Christianity. It is true that that some people question the veracity of the Spanish conquistadors and their quote-unquote desire to evangelize the new peoples, regardless of what things they found. But in fact, as the Spanish conquistadors come, they bring with them missionaries. They bring priests on every trip, and that's why throughout Mexico and the American Southwest, you will have this myriad of mission places, mission ruins, places that were established in the New World by these early Spanish missionaries. The second thing that comes from Europe to the Americas is iron technology. When Columbus and the boys arrived, Europe was well into its Iron Age. But the Native American populations were barely entering the Copper Age. This doesn't say anything about their scientific ability or their intelligence or anything like that. It's just they hadn't accidentally discovered the technology that would lead them to iron technology. They were just at this point learning to work with copper. Okay, they had discovered the ability, the gold and the silver, and were able to smelt the gold and the silver, but the copper, they hadn't yet discovered the ability to blend the copper with the tin to create bronze. So it's kind of like technologies in some cases are discovered by accident, and they just hadn't had that happy accident yet to where they could find bronze and then later iron ores. The next thing, sailing ships. The most of the Native American who went out on the ocean did not go very far out. They were sort of dugout canoe kind of things. They had boats that could navigate up and down the rivers, but they had yet to venture out into the open sea. Didn't have a really kind of a need for it. Another thing technologies are dependent upon is the fact that you find some accident that happens and you're able to postulate a use to fulfill some need. So they had not yet happened. As a matter of fact, when Cortez lands, the report that goes back to Montezuma was that these great shiny people were being carried aloft in giant canoes being driven by clouds. The sails were thought of as clouds driving their giant canoes. Okay, so they had not yet discovered sea travel. They also did not discover firearms. Of course, The Europeans had to discover gunpowder from China. The Chinese used the gunpowder in rockets and fireworks. Not all their fireworks are just for pretty displays. Some of the fireworks were used as weapons of warfare and signaling devices and things like that. But most of them depended on external combustion. You'd have your rocket, and the blast would come out, and the blast would cause the rocket, right, the firework to go. However, when the Europeans got a hold of the technology of the gunpowder, it was the Europeans who put the gunpowder within a cylinder and packed a projectile inside the cylinder, and when the gunpowder explodes, expanding gases force the projectile out of the firearm, which is basically internal combustion, which utilizes much more of the expanding gases and makes it makes for a different use for the gunpowder. So the gunpowder is something that the Europeans bring to the New World, whether it's internal or external combustion. Firearms are something that is brought. And also wheeled vehicles. Now, the Europeans had been using carts for centuries now, because they were able to identify the idea that if you have an axle which rolls, if you can expand the axle by placing wheels on spokes on the axle, it increases the amount of work that can be done. Okay? This was a discovery. This was something that they discovered could work. The Native Americans had not yet discovered it. As a matter of fact, when, for example, when the Olmec would create these colossal skulls, these colossal heads, these sculptures out of giant boulders, when they would move them from one place to another, the way they would do it is they would put logs down on the ground in a row, and they would push. So they understood this notion of rolling some item to make it easier to transport, but they had yet to stumble upon the idea of increasing the axle size. It's just, again, like I've said before, many technologies are discovered by happy accidents, which decrease the amount of force necessary to accomplish a lot more work. Okay? Wheeled vehicles, and then horses and other domesticated animals. Even though it's believed that in Mesoamerica, these parts of Mexico and the rainforest, there had at one point been horses. By the time Columbus and eventually Cortez arrive in central Mexico, horses had been hunted to extinction. So at this point, there are no horses in this region, and so these kinds of animals are reintroduced into the ecosystem by the Europeans, by the Spanish. So they're going to bring these resources back into the Western Hemisphere. But we also bring with us smallpox, measles, and other respiratory illnesses that are running rampant in Europe. At this point in Europe, many Europeans are starting to develop not a immunity, but a resistance to some of these diseases. The Native Americans, however, have no resistance to these diseases whatsoever. Most of these things are created, these bacteria and these germs are created in this sort of new environment of the rise of the city, where you've got close packed people living together in these new cities, and very, very poor sanitation. Lots of diseases and lots of germs are able to percolate in that kind of stuff. And when they bring those diseases over to the New World, it's going to have a detrimental effect on these peoples. Now, what are the things that go to Europe that the Europeans had not had before? The first thing, corn. Corn is not indigenous to Europe, but corn is a grass crop that can produce enormous return. It can produce enormous crops to feed a large people. That's how in Mesoamerica you're able to have 125,000 people in one sort of city-state in this area, because you've got a food source that you can plant one kernel in the ground, and when it grows and produces 3 ears with about 800 kernels per ear. So you're looking at, what is that, 2,400 kernels in return for one kernel? That's an enormous amount of increase for the foodstuffs, for this renewable resource of food. So corn is going to be a boon for Europe as this crop is going to start making its way back. Potatoes. There weren't potatoes in Europe. However, in Mesoamerica, there are dozens of different varieties of potatoes. Potatoes are going to be brought back to Europe because of how well they grow. The potato crop, as a matter of fact, most people are going to automatically think of the Irish and potatoes. And it's true that in the 1830s, 1840s, Irish civilization is hammered hard because of what was called the potato blight, right? This sort of potato famine in Ireland, because potatoes will become such a staple crop for these Europeans that when that crop is attacked and almost wiped out, it causes devastation. It causes devastation on the people. Now, the reason it caused a devastation is because the potatoes brought from the New World to Ireland were only 1 or 2 varieties of potatoes. So that with these 2 varieties of potato, there was no biodiversity, which would allow for some potatoes to have a better resistance to the potato blight than the other types of potatoes. But what happened, since there was no biodiversity, when the potato blight hit one area of Ireland, it spread throughout Ireland. And so you wound up having the potato famine in Ireland. So potatoes are a big crop. A matter of fact, it's England found its crop of fish in Newfoundland, and then the potatoes come to England, and England winds up its most iconic food, the classic fish and chips, were created by European exploration of the New World. Because these food substances are going to be inexpensive, and that's going to be what attracts the Europeans to them. Pineapples and other citruses, also tobacco, a Caribbean kind of tobacco. Now, Europeans know about tobacco, but during this time period, tobacco is harsh. It's harsh, and it burns your throat, and it's caustic. Most of the North African and the Indian peoples who smoke the tobaccos that they have access to smoke it through a water pipe called a hookah to filter the tobacco smoke and to cool it as it comes through. However, the Caribbean style of tobacco is such that when it burns, and the smoke almost has kind of a sweet flavor to it. It almost has kind of a sweet flavor to it. It's not as caustic. It doesn't burn as much. And so this new kind of tobacco is going to be something that the Europeans are going to crave. And then the last thing that goes back to Europe from the New World are sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea. These diseases, there is no medical record of these diseases existing in Europe prior to Columbus's men coming back from that first voyage. But immediately following Columbus's return, these diseases start making their appearance in Europe, and they go from Spain throughout the rest of Europe like a shotgun blast. Both sides are going to be detrimentally impacted by the Columbian Exchange, but both sides are going to receive beneficial things. Okay. Again, as I said, the Europeans are going to get the best part of this deal. One of the worst parts of this deal, I had said earlier that the iron technology was something that comes from Europe to the New World. Much of the iron technology that the Native American population are going to have exposure to is going to be in the form of chains with regard to the Spanish. The Spanish process of working this new world is to systematically begin enslaving these smaller tribal populations and putting them to work on the plantations that produce these crops to send back to Europe. And eventually, when they discover sugar cane as a crop, it's going to just exponentially increase how much slavery. So the chains and manacles will be the biggest iron technology that the Native Americans are going to experience. Okay, next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at two of these Spanish explorers. We're going to talk about Cortez and Pizarro. There are lots and lots of other Spanish explorers. You saw the maps, the explorations of North America, the myriad of explorations up and down the west coast of both North and South America. But the two we're going to deal with is Cortez and his encounter with the Aztec, and Pizarro and his encounter with the Inca. These two individuals are going to set the pattern for almost all European exploration, or at least all Spanish exploration into the New World. When these guys arrive, they will systematically enslave these populations, and when gold is discovered in mass, this enslavement process is going to increase exponentially. So we will get ready to do this next video, and we will watch Cortez and Pizarro.